I think the term climate emergency has become commonplace. Parliament has declared a climate emergency, and so have councils up and down the country. And with all the media coverage running up to COP26, I think there is this greater awareness of that emergency, and the scale of the challenge facing global leaders has arguably never been greater. But in terms of what that word, or those two words, climate emergency, really means, I think this is what we're going to see in the film. And we know that the world is hotter now than at any time in the last 12,000 years, and that 16 of the 17 hottest years on record have taken place since the year 2000. That record fires have been raging in the Amazon and the US, ice caps in Greenland melt at a terrifying pace, and storms and cyclones have been wreaking unimaginable tragedy in Central America and elsewhere. At the same time, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is a mouthful, it's called IPBES for short, but they too have been doing a lot of research into the state of nature globally, and they're reporting that there are now 1 million species that are threatened with extinction. Now, anyone passing through Westminster Tube just now can't fail to notice that the escalators, the barriers are all emblazoned with adverts urging MPs to work together for the future of humanity. And they warn that this moment is either a turning point or a burning point. And I think what keeps me awake at night as things stand is the sense that not enough is being done either globally or domestically to make this a turning point. That much is made of lots of targets, as we know, for net zero by 2050. But when someone's house is on fire, as Greta Thunberg has said it is, when someone's house is on fire, you don't ring 999 and ask for a fire engine in 30 years' time. You want that fire engine now because the emergency is now, and we want action now because the emergency is now. So this is our chance for transformational action. This is the chance for global leaders and decision makers to come together and with real vision and commitment to do what's necessary right now. And I think this film, Earth Emergency, is an important and powerful reminder of why this moment matters to so much. It's both a call to action and a warning bell. So I hope it'll encourage all who watch it to keep in mind that this is both an emergency of our own making, but one in which we do have every means to rise if we choose to tackle this emergency, if we can muster the political will. So with that short introduction from me, there are just two other things I need to do. One is to remind you that this session is being recorded. I hope that's okay. And the second is to say that if you have questions as opposed to chat, please could you put them in the Q&A box, and we will be operating an upvoting facility. So if you see a question that you like, then do vote for that to give us a better chance of being able to address it. Our meeting will be interspersed with 3 short excerpts from the film, and I want to ask Agnes now if she would show us the first one. Hopefully we will see that very shortly.
But it's more than our emissions heating the globe. Something else is at work here. The rising temperatures are setting in motion Earth's own natural warming mechanisms that then feed upon themselves.
The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice.
Emissions from fossil fuels are the input which add heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere, raising Earth's temperature and setting in motion self-perpetuating warming loops. Warming as a result of the warming itself. That ever-growing screeching noise is an apt analogy for the damage that human-caused feedback loops are wreaking on the planet. Scientists have identified dozens of feedback loops already in motion. It's imperative that we understand them if we're going to solve the climate crisis. As the climate warms, forests, once removers of carbon, release it back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, or CO2. Frozen ground in the northern hemisphere thaws and emits CO2 and methane. These are the kinds of feedback loops that lead to further warming, triggering the release of even more heat-trapping gases and raising the temperature even higher. In this series, we will highlight 4 of the major feedback loops impacting climate: the melting of sea ice in the Arctic Ocean, increased drought and fires in the world's forests, the decay of organic matter from permafrost thaw in the northern hemisphere, and disruptions to the jet stream and our global weather. Each amplifies warming, and combined, they are spinning out of control.
Thank you very much. It's a really powerful reminder of just how little we can be certain of when we're going to cross those tipping points. And as Greta said, you know, all of these targets that we hear so much about, like the cutting emissions in half by 2030, it's such a salutary reminder that that only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5. You know, if you were asked to get on an aeroplane that only had a 50% chance of not falling out of the sky before it reached its destination, then I guess you probably wouldn't do that. But I wanted to ask Professor Mitchell, if I might, just if you could say a little bit about risk and how we communicate that to the public, because it feels like we've got past the point where people are saying, you know, is global heating happening? But still, in terms of the impacts, there still seems there's quite a lot of work to be done to really communicate well on risk.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. And, you know, it's a great clip. And risk really is one of our Achilles heels. And the problem is climate science is so complex that no one person can understand the whole system. In fact, we pump sort of billions of pounds actually into the Met Office for hundreds of scientists to feed into the same system. And that's one of the problems, is communicating that complexity to the public, and risk is a really tough one. So we can never say for certain something is going to happen in the future. And under the Paris Agreement climate goals, Greta talks about this 50% chance of not achieving it. Well, there is a very, very small chance that we get to 2 degrees and our climate actually hasn't changed at all. But that chance is so small, we sort of, you know, we put that at the bottom. On the other end, there is a chance that the impacts of climate change are so large that, you know, even much more drastic things happen to the climate system than we're saying. And so communicating that uncertainty, people are used to science, you know, Isaac Newton type science, you know, gravity does something and you can drop an apple and you see that it falls. That doesn't happen with climate change science. You can drop the apple and a range of outcomes would come about. So that's the trouble with communicating risk.
Thank you. And I was going to ask Bonnie and Susan maybe if they could have a comment about how they went about thinking how to communicate these quite complex issues in a way that was compelling and accessible and interesting to people, and whether indeed in the course of making the film you had a sense of whether or not the public are just bored by this now because it's just so horrible and you don't want to think about it, or whether you really felt that you know the public appetite for change is growing. Maybe I'll come to Bonnie first, if that's okay.
Okay, that's a great question. Well, we did think about how we could best present this to people who may have heard about global warming but don't quite understand these feedback loop mechanisms. And we felt like this is what gave the film its own sort of angle, special angle, because people, of course, have heard about climate change and global warming, but they don't really necessarily, a lot of people haven't heard about feedback loops. We did a survey. In fact, the producer of this whole project, Barry Hershey, came to us and said, I keep hearing about feedback loops and I keep asking people if they've heard of them. And most people, even very well educated people, say, no, I haven't heard of them. Of course, the scientists know about them. And so our goal was to really explain the mechanisms of feedback loops, really focusing on that very specifically. And you saw the graphic we used. And so we kept trying to reprise this graphic so people really understood the cyclical nature of these loops. So that's really how we went about it, as a way to try to communicate this very complicated science, these mechanisms, to the public in a way that would shed a little new light on the topic and try to really ground them in the science of it.
Yeah.
Susan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the answer to that question is simplicity. We wanted to keep them very simple, and we had one idea, and that was feedback loops. What are they? And this notion that the Earth is heating the Earth, that once you kick off this warming, it creates all these amplifying warming effects, and people aren't including them in the models. So when we talk about 1.5 degrees, well, that's a number that's out there somewhere, and we can all feel comfortable trying to reach it. But when your house is on fire, which we can see by looking at the news every day, it out there doesn't matter. That's a number. What matters is here and now. And the scientists know what's going on. They've been up at night thinking about feedback loops for over 50 years. So our feeling was, okay, so let's listen to them. And Greta says this all the time. Don't ask me, I'm a kid. Listen to the scientists. So we found the best climate scientists in the world, and we asked them what, and we showed it. I think it's really important to show these numbers don't come out of nothing. They come out of the field, and these people collecting data over decades and decades. And as you know, in the past, man didn't know why it was heating up. We prayed to the gods. Well, now we do know. I mean, we had the science is there. It's irrefutable. We know. So our idea was really simple. Let's go to the scientists and let them explain what these feedback loops are. And the goal was, by the end of the year 2022, as many Americans and Europeans and people all over the globe would be staying up at night worrying about feedback loops, not just the scientists.
And it's a bit of a controversial question, Dan, maybe it's a bit unfair, but do you think in some way that the scientists have not done enough to sound the alarm loudly enough? I think there's a kind of tension, at least it feels as if there might be, between keeping a message that is simple and accessible and understandable versus trying to capture some of this complexity, which actually means that, at least as I read what you're saying, that when we're looking at these different targets, then we absolutely need to be treating them as the absolute minimum we must do, because we haven't factored in the tipping points that could be just around the corner.
Yeah, well, so, you know, just to be clear, when the Paris Agreement came around, which was 2015, and we talked about 1.5 and 2 degrees, you know, these tipping points were very much factored into the scientific arguments. And, you know, the point that Susan and Bonnie are making is that didn't necessarily come through into other non-scientific arenas, and that's a very valid one. We, you know, I guess the main body on climate change, the international one, is the International Panel on Climate Change, of which I'm part of, and I edited one of the latest report. The problem with that is we've been criticised that we report on the most likely scenarios. We don't report on the really extreme scenarios. And this year we've seen a few events which we had to hold up our hand and say, damn it, you know, we didn't even get there. A very obvious one was the Pacific Northwest heat wave. You know, that was 5 degrees warmer than the next highest temperature there. It was claimed our models couldn't pick it up. That's untrue, actually. Our models could pick it up. But when 100 models are telling you one thing and one model's telling you another, you just, we look at that average. And actually, we know what we should be doing more is saying, look, this model is showing us this. We've no reason to believe it more than these, but perhaps we should prepare for that one occasion. That's just normal climate variability. What Bonnie and Susan are talking about is tipping points, and that's where the system cracks. And, you know, that's a whole different kettle of fish, because our problem is we haven't observed that cracking very well in our climate yet. And so we don't know if our models are any good at doing it. That's the real problem here, whereas we've observed heat waves and floods and things, so we can get an estimate. And that's where some of these are really dangerous. And the melting of the ice sheets in particular is a dangerous one because we haven't seen an ice-free region, at least not with satellite data, but others are as well. So yeah, very tough.
Thank you. Let me just welcome Anna McMorrin, who I know has had travel difficulties, which is why she's only just joining us now. But Anna is the vice chair, I think, of the All-Party Group on Net Zero and indeed the Climate Change Group. And I don't know, you probably didn't see the little video clips, so I probably can't ask you about tipping points at this point. If there is something you want to say just now, let me know. Otherwise, we'll move to the second clip. I'm assuming that means, Anna, that we'll go to the second clip.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. Apologies for being late. Terrible travel difficulties this morning, but I'm glad I'm here. Let's move to the second clip, and good to be part of the discussion.
Lovely, thanks, Anna. So if Agnes could take us to the second clip, and if I can just remind people, if they want to ask questions, do please put them in the Q&A function.
With the clock ticking, it comes down to how we manage temperate forests. Use them for commercial purposes or keep them intact to cool the planet. While human activity has kicked off natural warming loops, human ingenuity could reverse their direction, turning them into cooling feedbacks instead. It would mean protecting and expanding forests, preserving marshes, grasslands, and all natural habitats. Using agricultural practices that store carbon instead of releasing it, and letting trees and plants do their job of taking carbon out of the air. This would lower Earth's temperature and kick in a self-perpetuating cooling feedback loop. George Woodwell was an early pioneer warning about fossil fuel use, setting off warming feedback loops 5 decades ago. He's convinced the solution lies with nature's own ability to cool the planet.
We can store carbon in life. If we want to be optimistic, we have to be very progressive in our transition away from fossil fuels and into a new green world. But it takes imagination, interest, and a recognition of the reality of an Earth that is failing at the moment. We can't allow it to be too late.
Thank you very much. Some amazing photography and filming there as well. So we've got a couple of questions already in the chat, so perhaps I'll come to these first of all in the Q&A. So from Maddie Rocklin, for the filmmakers, how has your work on the film changed your understanding of climate change and your day-to-day actions and choices as a result, if at all? And what can others who watch the film, who also aren't scientists, take into our daily lives to make a difference? And then if I can come to Susan first on that one.
We went into this thinking we knew about feedback loops just like everybody else did. And I was a geologist by training, and I realized how little I knew. And the more I learned, the more I realized how bad it was. And that was a problem actually making the film. How much bad news do you want to deliver? Because these loops compound on themselves. So, and there are all these other loops that are being set off every time one of these is set off. So, you know, Bonnie, I'll let you answer this. I think we were both, the two of us, talking to each other about why we'd ever had kids, and we went into that dark loop that you go into, is where is this all going to end? And I think since then, I personally have come sort of about face. I feel like we have to change the discussion. It's very negative right now. It's like we can't get to 1.5, you know. It should be a positive. This is a chance to retool our economies. And it's a chance, I mean, everybody I talk to is now aware of it. When I started my work, you know, decades ago, the public wasn't aware and didn't really care. And we thought eventually when Al Gore's film came out, Inconvenient Truth, that things were going to change. And when they didn't change, we all got that much more cynical. And it's something about the era that we're in, seeing it play out around us, Greta and what she's doing with the youth movement, I think there's much more openness now to people listening. And I think the discussion really should be the next great economic engine that's going to be driving all of our economies is the green economy. We can't avoid it. You know, in the United States, it was the tech economy. That's over. Now it's the green economy. And I think and Biden's doing that. He's being, in our country, good about talking about the economic effects. And I think if that's the discussion going forward and we turn it into a positive one and a global cooperation one, it's really an opportunity to regreen the planet, like it says in the clip, and to go back to the ways that we know work and let the planet do its work. I mean, right now, trees take out 30% of all of the emissions we put into the air every year. Oceans take out 25%. Technology takes out 0. And it's going to be a long time between technology takes out enough to make a difference, capture carbon. So I think the wisdom in that short little clip that you saw, and that man, George Woodwell, who's really a hero in the environmental movement, is that we have to figure out how to maintain what's left of our biodiversity and use that to set off these feedback loops in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a great argument for keeping the two different COPs in our minds, the Conference of the Parties. There's the one for biodiversity that's had an awful lot less focus on than the one obviously in Glasgow on climate, and the two really do need to be addressed together. I will come to Bonnie next, and I wonder, as well as maybe having a comment on that last question, it feeds into this next question from Emily Butler, because Susan, you were kind of saying how much bad news can people absorb? And the question from Emily was, how do we find the balance between raising awareness, but also triggering eco-anxiety and in a sense just turning people off because it's just all too difficult? So I wonder, Bonnie, what consideration you gave to that.
Yeah, thanks. I also want to just refer back to the last question
Sure.
about what we can do, because I think it ties into this question. It was very difficult learning about all this stuff. I did about 9 months of research, and as Susan knows, I would get incredibly overwhelmed by the depressing news that I was reading. And it spurred me to put solar panels on my house and get a hybrid car and take all of the action I could personally take. I think Susan misspoke. We do have children, but we've been talking to our children about having children, because it was the idea of bringing more people into the world, knowing what we knew, just terrified me. And I've actually said to my kids, have you considered adopting a climate refugee? Because there's going to be a lot of kids who are going to need parents in the future. So that whole thing really shook me, the idea of so many billions of people in the world. In terms of what you can do, we asked every scientist we interviewed, what would you tell people, they can do if they ask you? And a lot of them said, you can vote for the right candidates. You can talk about this at dinner parties, cocktail parties with your friends, with your families, share these films. The best thing you can do is talk about it and let people know. And that brings us to the next question, which is, how do you balance that with not sleeping at night? And it's a tough one. I've had many sleepless nights over this. And I think, I'm just hoping that we're at this tipping point where the world is finally coming together. And thanks a lot to Greta Thunberg and her demonstrations. And I'm just hoping it's not too late. A lot of the scientists say it's not too late to at least curb the warming. We all have to do our part. We have to talk about it. We have to vote. We have to demonstrate. We have to just make it a big part of our lives. And I think if you feel like you're doing something, maybe it would help you feel better that you have a role in it and you can do your part. So that's what I would recommend.
Thanks, Bonnie. I was going to come to Dan with this question from Norman Tovey. What do we really mean by net zero? And frankly, that's a question in itself. That little net, those 3 little letters, hide an awful lot in many respects. But also what Norman goes on to talk about is really the difference between territorial emissions and imported emissions, and whether or not we should be including the embedded carbon of our imports. Otherwise, it looks as if we're doing quite well in terms of our emission reduction targets, and countries like China, who are doing lots of the manufacturing for us, obviously look as if they're doing much less well. So could I put that to Dan?
Yeah, well, it's a very complex question, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to answer it all, because that's a lecture in itself. But the basics is net zero means the amount we emit is essentially close to zero, and that little bit of extra that we might emit, we can recapture back through some sort of carbon capture in storage technology. That amount we can recapture back is a lot less than people claim. People have spoken a lot about carbon capture and storage technologies being the solution. They're certainly not. They're 10% of the problem. They solve 10% of the problem, but there's 90% that have to be done through emission reductions, not recapture. And I guess there's a bit of an in-joke in the community, especially with the engineers, where we spent 10, nearly 15 years trying to design technology that could really capture carbon dioxide and store it. And at the end, we just designed a tree, and that is the solution. Trees are amazing. You have to be very careful where you plant them, because they can actually cause local temperature problems because of the way they reflect the sunlight. But if you're well informed, planting trees is the way forward. In terms of your almost how do you farm out the carbon credits? So the question is arising essentially because if someone flies into your zone, can you sort of sell the carbon credits back to that country, and then you didn't emit that carbon, they did? I don't think we should get into that here. It's a very difficult debate, because it's actually not a straight answer to that one. So yeah, we'll leave it at that.
Okay, we'll have the next session on that one.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, Susan, please do. Yeah,
Dan, you're a man after my own heart. You made me so happy just now when you said that about the trees. So, I mean, for everybody's talking about everything else you can do, nobody's talking about not cutting down the old growth forests. The lumber industry is very powerful, and it's really, believe it or not, a hot topic. And when we started this, Bonnie and I mean, the role of filmmakers, we watched a little film called Burned, and it was about the wood pellet industry, and exactly that. The accounting that they do to make it look like where you harvest the tree, so you emit, you cut down branches and carbon goes into the air, that gets accounted, but then where you burn it doesn't get accounted. Pick one or the other, but not both, which is ridiculous, because we know the burning, combustion is the worst thing you can do in terms of putting carbon in the air, and trees are worse. They're worse than coal, and the fine particles are more unhealthy for you. And what's going on now is with the wood pellet industry, they've convinced everybody that this is green energy. And it started out as we're going to clean up the refuse from logging, and that will be the pellets, but it's created an economic engine now that has to be fed. And they're wiping out old growth forests to feed the wood pellet industry, which is the worst thing you can do for the environment. So when it comes to educating yourself, those are the things we need to educate ourselves about. The problem is global and big now. It's not just how to put solar panels on your house, it's how to hold your public officials accountable and know what's really going on. And I think that's where this youth movement and Greta, what she gets so angry about is because those things are not being said.
Thank you. I mean, absolutely about the trees. If I could just give a plug here in the UK, at least, to peatland as well, because peat captures even more carbon than trees, and yet it's often deemed to be the kind of slightly poor cousin in the debates around what we need to do when it comes to nature capturing carbon. And in this country, we have the crazy situation where we deliberately set fire to our peat bogs in order to clear them ready for some grouse shooting, which is another whole debate, but it's an important one. Anna, is there anything you would like to reflect on or ask about, or from your perspective of the Net Zero APPG?
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. I think that what that film really highlighted was the role, the ecological emergency that we're facing. That's equal to what we generally talk about as the climate emergency, and what everybody is going to be talking about at COP just next week. I think, Caroline, you just touched on it, peat bogs, which actually I raised in Parliament last week during a question. the UK government strategy currently only covers a third of peat bogs. Well, actually less than a third of peat bogs, I think a quarter. So most peat bogs, as Caroline said, are being burnt. Now that it just seems to me to be the opposite of what action we should be taking. So, you know, I think that that's a simple thing that the government can do here and now. But I think, you know, there needs to be a stepping up of action right across the globe and from all governments at every single level, whether that's from councils to devolved governments, which I've had a lot to do with. I was special advisor in the Welsh government, attending COP, working, representing 50 states and regions across the world in the run-up to the Paris Climate Agreement as well, to get their voices captured in the Paris Climate Agreement itself, which we managed to do, because we've got to remember that it's those actions closer to people that are going to actually do the work of what is agreed to keep global warming to below 1.5, hopefully the ambitious 1.5, and certainly below 2 degrees, which would be devastating. But I think just quickly, I think the other thing we've got to remember is the impact on the world's most vulnerable, because we are going to be seeing, I think Bonnie, you mentioned climate refugees. We are going to see a huge increase before this century is out of millions. We're already seeing climate refugees, but we are going to see that on the increase. And with in our most vulnerable countries across the world, developing nations, we are seeing a mixture of climate impact, conflict, as well as COVID. Those three devastating issues really impacting. So I really just hope that next week, in the next couple of weeks at COP, the governments are going to come together with a proper climate finance package that is going to reach the people that actually need it, not just get absorbed away, and that it's actually going to be in the form of grants, not loans, and increase country debt, which is another issue. And just quickly, the reason I'm actually late today is because I couldn't find a charging point for my electric car on my journey up. They were all taken. So in the end, I got to the last few miles in my car. I literally had to sit and wait for somebody to charge their car before I could charge mine. So that's the kind of practical everyday thing that we face, but we need more infrastructure everywhere.
Thanks, Anna. We'll come to the third clip now, but I'm aware that there are questions that we haven't yet answered in the Q&A, so I'll come to that after we've seen the third clip. So if Agnes, you could get that up for us.
With every country contributing to the problem, each now needs to be part of the solution.
That requires managing the world in such a way that we do not exploit carbon compounds and dump the waste into the atmosphere.
In every sector of the economy, we have the technology and knowledge to move toward sources of energy that do not produce heat-trapping gases. What we need is the will.
I'm encouraged by the fact that other countries have decarbonized their electricity sector in 10 to 12 years. So I know we can do it, and those countries that did it, by the way, grew their economies rapidly while doing it. But we have to put the incentives in place. The most important thing citizens can do is to educate themselves on this issue and vote for politicians who take this problem seriously and have good ideas for how to solve it.
Communicating with our policymakers that this is important to us, that this is impacting each one of us, that this is important for human health, for human well-being, is the most important action that each one of us can take.
To successfully address climate change requires unprecedented level of societal cooperation across nations, cooperation within nations, across multiple sectors.
Today, we have a choice. We can continue with business as usual and let these warming feedback loops spin out of control, or we can choose another way of living and implement policies that support a sustainable future. But we need leaders who understand the urgency of getting it done, and an energized public to advocate for change.
Thank you very much. Okay, so maybe I'll pick up a couple of the questions that we've not addressed yet from the chat. There was one from Andrew Lockery to the filmmakers. How do we get the film to be more widely circulated and for more people in countries around the world to watch and understand the feedback loop problems? And then Pritam kind of responds to that, saying it's not just about circulating the film, it must be an education matter. So beginning at schools would be the best place in my eyes. What I learned is that everything starts with the right education. So I wondered if you could maybe tell us a little bit about how widely the film has already been distributed. I know you did start off saying a little bit about that, but in particular, are there any plans to get it into schools? Bonnie is going to go to you first.
Sure, I'll start. Yes, there are big plans to get them into schools. So this project started as 5 short films that we made that do live on a website. And we created the 1-hour Earth emergency film from the 5 short films. So we do have 2 versions, and we have hired a company to create an educational curriculum to use in schools for grades 6 through 12, and also in universities. So we are pursuing that. It's actually going to be ready very shortly, and they will unveil it with a big webinar for science teachers across the United States. And we are hoping to get it used abroad as well. Although the curriculum we developed meets the requirements in the United States, but it can certainly be adapted for other countries and used around the world. In terms of, so I just wanted to mention the 5 short films can be viewed now up on the website, and which I can put in the
yeah. If you could put the link.
But we have a distributor selling the 1-hour Earth emergency to television markets around the globe. And he's already sold it to countries like Australia, India, Mongolia, Portugal, all over, Asia, Latin America, Europe. It will be seen. It's really exciting what the interest that we've received in showing this film. The time does seem to be right. So we really are making a push to get the film seen and used.
And I'd just like to add that this film was launched by the Dalai Lama and Greta Thunberg. And it was launched on a worldwide webcast. There were over 1 million people on it. And the Dalai Lama had just written a book about climate change and the environment. And his very first paragraphs of that book were a letter to Greta, thanking her for the work that she's doing. And the 2 of them had never met. So they both said, well, if the Dalai Lama will be on this, I'll be on this, and vice versa. If Greta will be on this, I'll be on this. And it was really a wonderful place to begin, because it started from a very spiritual place of unity and how we can all work together. And we got from there, I think, a lot of forward momentum for the films.
Thank you. I mean, a film that has the support and endorsement of the Dalai Lama and Greta Thunberg and Richard Gere as the narrator, it seems to me to be off to a flying start. So congratulations on all of that. I was going to ask just one question, just because it has been upvoted. And it's a question that, although it's not directly relevant to this film, it does come up in so many debates and in so many political responses as to why countries like the UK aren't doing more. And it's from Owen Pugh, who says a common question heard from the public is, what's the point of the UK cutting its 1% of global emissions if countries like China aren't doing their part? And I wondered if Dan can say anything on that without getting into the depths of consumption emissions and so on and so forth. But
yeah, sure. And interestingly, I was actually talking to Beijing News this morning, and well, let's say I put my foot in my mouth there, but one of the, for a start, every little bit helps. And yes, if China and the US and India and various others are not on board, then it is tough for the, just the UK were doing it, we wouldn't see much of a change. But someone needs to take leadership, and these things always follow leaders. And, you know, this was where we were so disappointed when Donald Trump got into power and pulled out of the Paris Agreement, because such a monumental achievement. And when the Paris Agreement came about, we all heard good things, and we knew something good was coming. And we thought, you know what, they're going to tell us we need to stabilize climate at 2 degrees. And we thought, yes, that's great. And then they said, oh, and strive for 1.5. And every scientist in the world put up their hand and thought, yeah, damn it, we actually don't know the science of 1.5 degrees. We haven't got the tools into place there. And that was pushed very much by small island states who, you know, basically said our islands are underwater at 2 degrees, and then they're not at 1.5 degrees. So they were the smallest voices, but we thought, you know, great, we've got the US on board and stuff. And then they pulled out, and people's hearts did sink. And so I would say, yes, if it was just the UK on its own, you know, we would really struggle. Every little bit matters, and we need leaders. And the UK, while our carbon emissions per person are incredibly high, by the way, we've just got such small population compared to, say, India or the US. You know, but we are a good player on the global stage on a number of fronts. So if we were to lead, others would follow, I hope.
And I think as well, surely what matters is the cumulative impact of emissions over time in the atmosphere, and that much of the warming that's happening right now is a result of emissions that were emitted some decades ago, when, as a proportion, the UK was far more responsible proportionally than we look as if we are now. And as the country that pretty much led the Industrial Revolution, when you look at those kind of per capita responsibilities for cumulative emissions in the atmosphere, then the UK is by no means just at 1%. I mean, there's a greater responsibility there. I was trying to find a question in the Q&A, but it keeps moving. I'm not sure if that's because other people are upvoting things. So unless I can find it very quickly, I'll come to another one. It was to do with someone saying that they go to community meetings and people are, by and large, the public are very up for wanting to act, but what they want is to know how they can get the information they need in order to act. And I just wondered if anyone, if any people here can share any good places that they've found where there were the kind of good websites or anything else where people can get information easily. Because on the one hand, we keep saying to people, you've got to act, this really matters. And then, yes, they can write to their MPs or their councillors. But in terms of getting good advice on what they can actually do, and here in the UK, we had an environmental commission set up by the IPPR, the Institute for Public Policy Research, where we suggested there should be something we were calling a kind of a green go one-stop shop, where you could find information on everything from insulating your home and what the grants were, through to where your electric charging points were and how you could get grants for those kinds of vehicles. Bonnie, great.
There is a website that everyone should visit called drawdown.org. And there's a book called Drawdown. I believe the author is Peter Hawken, and it's 100 things you can do to, I forget the exact title, to, you know, deal with climate change. And he has very practical solutions in his book. And the website, I think, has even gone beyond the book. And there are lots of advice of what an individual can do, what a company can do, what the world can do on lots of different levels. So I always recommend people go to that site, because we hear that a lot when we screen our film, what can I do? And our film really does not address that, except, you know, at the end, we do talk about preserving forests, which is key, and wetlands and bogs and grasslands. But in terms of what an individual can do, we do try to send people to this website where there are practical solutions.
Great. And then I wanted to begin to draw us to a close by putting this question to all of you from Louise Reddy. And Louise says, public awareness has increased massively over the past 5 years on the topic of climate change, thanks to films like this one. And it's got everyone talking about the importance of COP26. But how can we keep the momentum that we felt in the build up to COP26 going after the COP? And this is something that I'm really concerned about, in a sense. There's been so much emphasis, rightly so, about what happens in the next couple of weeks in Glasgow. and then what happens after that? And maybe there will be an amazing breakthrough, but on the other hand, maybe there won't. And how do we really make sure that people keep in this for the long haul and know that that it's absolutely important to keep the momentum running? I wonder if I could come to Anna first. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. You make a very good point there, because although the focus over the past 18 months, 2 years has been the next 2 weeks in Glasgow and coming together, and it is very important that when the world comes together there, that there are some commitments, and we do see those all important nationally determined contributions, and the signs are really worrying at the moment as to what's not going to be agreed or at Glasgow. So all the more reason why we need to keep up the pressure after Glasgow and maintain this commitment. And I think films like this play a really, really important role in doing that. So thank you for your efforts, and I will spread the word on these films, and absolutely. But I think politicians across the world have a role to play. We as elected representatives, Caroline and myself, have a role to play. I think people need to know and need to write to MPs to know that this is maintained, this discussion is happening out there in communities, and at whatever level, as I keep going back to, whether that is at council level, whether that is at devolved level in the Welsh government, Scottish government, or across the world at local devolved level. And I think it's also really important that legislation changes to allow change to take place. So, for example, and I know Caroline's been a little bit involved in this recently, but I helped create the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I drafted it in Wales, which is a world-leading act to basically put sustainability as a duty on all public bodies. So whenever public bodies, whether that's local government, police, or whatever, make a decision, or social services make a decision, they need to consider a whole array of things, including climate change. And that needs to be at the very heart of whatever decisions are being made at government level. So I think we can be pushing that at UK level and within other governments across the world. Things like that, legislation, action that actually makes a difference, I think is really very important. But please, please, please keep up the pressure, writing, putting pressure on your MPs and politicians.
Lovely, thanks, Anna. Dan, is it fair to ask for your reflections on this, even though I guess people aren't lobbying you directly, but in terms of how you think we can try and keep the momentum going?
Well, we do get lobbied in the IPCC, and that you may recall the front page of the IPCC, of the BBC 3 days ago was about potential lobbying.
Oh, that's true.
That was essentially my job, was to stop that happening. So it didn't happen, I'll add. But I very much second what Anna was saying, and I think by far the single most important thing you can do for climate change is just be on the case of your politicians. And and the thing I say is you should make it very clear that you're going to elect your politicians based on their green agenda, and you should make it very clear that you're going to re-elect them on how well they actually did do what they said they would do. And that second point is where I think we failed a lot in the UK, is we have said a lot of things in the past, but if you look at the carbon emissions, they're still not, they're not great at all for the UK or anywhere. And really making those points is the only way to get us there. And the government has the power to make us into a green powerhouse. And I laughed a little bit at Anna's, car not being charged properly. That's exactly is the problem. And I sent a tweet that sort of went very well about a week ago, and I said it was going to cost me £330 return by train to COP, or £46 return by plane to COP. Now, if you don't have money, you have to pick one choice. Until we start having things in place to do that, there's no chance we can fight the climate crisis, and that has to come from our government.
Well said. And I think one of the frustrations, certainly talking as a politician here, is just to see that so many times there are policies that have great social as well as environmental impacts, like a properly funded home insulation scheme, street by street, local authority led, which would get people's emissions down, it would get their fuel bills down, it would create hundreds of thousands of jobs all around the country. And yet we're still not seeing that at the scale that I think we need. Okay, I'm going to come finally to Susan and then Bonnie. So Susan, some final reflections on momentum.
I'm going to say something. So I've broken it down because I had time to think while all of you were going into sort of 3 areas. And the first is the private sector. And, we were living in the country that pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. And it was a horrible time for those of us who knew the consequences of that and were totally against it. And I was really pleased to read later that a lot of companies were stepping up to the plate and continuing meeting the goals that had been set and setting their own targets. Prince Charles is going to be hosting 3 days where he's kicking off his climate initiative among CEOs and business leaders at Glasgow, and he's going to be showing our film. I think it's called Magna Terra, his initiative. And I think where you put your money is really important, and being aware of the companies that are trying to do the right thing. So the fact that Anna broke down and we missed her for 5 minutes is nothing compared to the fact that she chose to put her money into an electric car. And I think those are really important decisions that we can all make. But we struggled in these films. We couldn't put every solution in. And where do you even begin? Turn off your lights. I mean, it was really a difficult thing because we want to tell you about feedback loops. And we let Greta say it. And what Greta says in the film is that every great change has been driven by the people, and that we have to raise our voices. It's really simple. You have to speak out. And that's why I love Greta, is because she sees the horror of what's going on. We're losing 200 species a day, and the emotion is behind, we have to do something about it. She's not an older person who's put barriers up. She says how she feels. And I think all of us have to look it in the face and realize what really is going on, and commit to speaking up, just speaking to our friends and our families and talking. And the last thing I have is democracy. I mean, in theory, we all still live in democracies, right? And in democracies, you can hold your public elected officials accountable, and you'll see that these anti-environmental movements have been launched by petrol companies and big business and money, and they are very organized because they have the money behind it to be very organized. And we have to be very organized. And where we get our information to know who's the right person to vote for is the key to a good functioning democracy. And there are a lot of organizations out there that do that. They follow the voting records. They tell you who to vote for. You don't have to spend all your time finding that out. I used to run a door-to-door canvass in California for an organization called the California League of Conservation Voters. And they would every day go in and see what bills were, what people were voting on, and give them a score on how they were as politicians and representatives. So I would say that is the third thing. Find out where you can get your information without, it can't be a full-time job. All of us have jobs.
Perfect, thank you. And a final word to Bonnie.
Thanks. Yeah, I have to echo what Susan said. I totally agree with everything she said. I think we really have to counteract this idea that you can cut down a tree if you plant a tree, because it's not the same. And I think there's this very pat kind of feeling like, oh, plant a tree, save the earth. And yeah, I mean, obviously we want to plant as much greenery as we can, but that's not the same as cutting down a 100-year-old tree that's storing a ton of carbon. I think people really have to be educated about that it's not, you can't just log an old tree and then plant a seedling and expect it to do the same kind of carbon storage, because it just doesn't work like that. So I think there has to be better communication to people about what they should advocate for. And I know there's a lot of new like agricultural new sort of grasses and wheat plants that can store carbon too. And I know that places in the US are looking at these kind of new crops that can store carbon better. So I just think there has to be better education on what we should preserve, what we should be using to try try to keep as much carbon in the ground as we can. I'll just add that.
Thank you so much. Well, just in terms of my reflection, as we come to an end now, I guess I would just say that just as there are scientific tipping points, as you've shown in your film, here's hoping that there are political tipping points as well, and that change doesn't have to be incremental, that there might just become that moment when the penny drops and people realize that we absolutely do need to go for this as the #1 priority. And in terms of trying to end on a more positive note, I think that awful as the COVID pandemic was, government's response to the pandemic, by and large, not all of them, but most of them did demonstrate that when there's a shared understanding of a crisis, governments can act at speed and scale. You know, they can, here in the UK, cancel NHS debt overnight. They can house the homeless. They can, for a while at least, put health and well-being above profit and growth. And that, I think, gives us some hope that sometimes you can just take that moment and really try to ensure that government intervenes for the good of everybody, and not according to business as usual. But let me thank again all of our wonderful speakers, and particularly the filmmakers. Thank you so much for sharing this film with us. Thank you to everybody who's been joining us online, and here's to hopefully a successful COP and keeping the momentum up afterwards. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.